Welcome, everybody. We want to start right on time to make sure we maximize the time with our fantastic panel today. I am Wendy Schiller. I am the interim director of the Watson Institute. For this talk, though, I am the director of the Taubman Center, and we're really very excited to bring Yoni Appelbaum here in a conversation moderated with Marc Dunkelman. We were very excited to bring Yoni Appelbaum here. We booked this months ago, but some of you might have seen David Brooks' column in the New York Times on Friday, really extolling the virtues not only of Yoni Appelbaum's book, but of course of Marc Dunkelman's book, as you got that one? Okay. Marc Dunkelman's forthcoming book as well. So I'm going to do a very brief biography of each of our panelists, and then Yoni Appelbaum will be speaking for about 10 minutes, do a bit of a summary of his book, and then they'll sit down and have a moderated conversation, and we'll leave about 15 to 20 minutes for Q&A. And when we do Q&A, we are taping this. That's an old-fashioned word. We're recording it to put on the website for YouTube, for our YouTube channel. So we will be passing around microphones at that time. Okay, so Yoni Appelbaum is a deputy executive editor of The Atlantic and a social and cultural historian of the United States. Before joining The Atlantic, he was a lecturer on history and literature at Harvard University. His academic work examined associative republicanism from 1865 to 1900, which he puns as the Gilded Age, arguing for the centrality of groups like the Knights of Pythias, Chicago Lumber Exchange, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and more. He previously taught at Babson College and at Brandeis University, where he received his PhD in American history. And our other panelist is Marc Dunkelman. Marc Dunkelman is a faculty fellow at the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. His work at Brown focuses on the architecture of American community and the progressive movement's evolving view of power. In 2014, W.W. Norton published his first book, The Vanishing Neighbor, The Transformation of American Community. He worked for more than a dozen years in Washington. He also served as senior fellow at the Clinton Foundation. He worked on the Senate Judiciary Committee, in the House of Representatives, and at the Democratic Leadership Council. His work has appeared most recently in Politico, and I believe referenced in the New Yorker most recently, and
The Atlantic.
Then the Atlantic. The Atlantic.
For cereal.
So we are, this is sort of like an academic dream come true when you book a panel and then, the whole world wants to hear from this panel. So we're really excited. Without further ado, Yoni Appelbaum.
So thank you all so much for coming out this evening. I'm thrilled to be here. Even more thrilled to be doing this together with Marc, who I've known for 25 years now, and he's written a truly extraordinary book of his own, and we'll get into that. But I want to start today by telling you about a woman who few Americans have ever heard of, named Mary Edsley, who lived almost exactly 200 years ago in the state of Ohio. And she lived at one of the interesting pivot points in human history. And she is, in some sense, a inadvertent and forgotten civil rights hero. She was born into a world in which your prospects were largely determined by the circumstances of your birth. In the old world, most identities were inherited, right? So you were born in a village, attached to a piece of land. You generally did not have the right to leave the place where you were born. Certainly not the right to join some other community. Your religion was inherited at birth. Your occupation was often inherited. And you existed within an incredibly hierarchical and tightly bounded life. That was the way most old world societies had ordered themselves. In the New World, something like that initially exists. When people come over to the United States, the early colonists, they're not trying to create a radical new society. They're trying to replicate and perfect what they'd had in the old world. And so they plant communities here, and they import the English system of warning out. You are warning people out if somebody comes into your community and wishes to reside there. They don't have the right to do that. The community can deliver a written notice to them, which says you have 2 weeks to leave. And then if they stay, they could be bound up by the town sergeant and taken back to their proper place, the community of origin. And this is the way the world works. Everybody is attached to a particular place. Identity is largely heritable. Prospects are largely determined by the lottery of your birth. That is not the world that we inhabit today. And as much as anyone, we can thank Mary Ersley for that. I don't know much about her life because the records don't tell us much about her. But in 1821, she was living in Wayne Township, Ohio, with her father. And she was a legal resident of Wayne Township. So Wayne had accepted her. They had not delivered one of these notices and said, you're not welcome here. But they moved. They moved to Stock, which is another town a little way further west. And they try to establish residence there. And Stock warns them out, delivers a number of notices, doesn't physically remove them, but it tells them, you don't really belong here in Stock. Eventually, Mary falls on hard times. She becomes a public charge. And the trustees of Stock transport her physically back to Wayne. Wayne says, hey, she's been living in Stock for years. And they send her back to Stock. Stock says, we don't want her. And they send her back to Wayne. This poor woman is getting bounced around from two towns, neither of which accepts her. And she's in a liminal state. This is a world in which everybody needs a proper place, and she doesn't have one. And the courts eventually intervene here. Wayne sues Stock and says, fine, we'll keep her, but you're going to pay. And it goes before the justices of the Ohio Supreme Court. And they do something really interesting. They say, look, we know what the law says. The law says that she's forever the charge of Wayne until some other town accepts her. But we also know that we are trying to people this land. How could we have a land of opportunity in which your residence in the place you choose to live is subject to revocation, right? How could we continue to operate a system in which any of your, if your neighbors decide, they can deliver a notice and say, you're not welcome here. America needs to be a place which operates by a different logic, a logic of individual agency, a logic of opportunity. And by the way, Ohio is competing with Illinois and Indiana, and how are we getting anyone to move here if we treat people like this? And so they find a way to sidestep the law. They basically overturn the law. And from that moment forth, you can chart a progression. Within a decade or two, residence is no longer a question of whether or not a community will accept you. It is a question of where you want to live. It hinges on intent. That's a subtle transformation. But what it does is it opens up the heyday of American mobility. Once Americans can live wherever they want, they move with astonishing rapidity. And they move from one state to another, from one community to another, from one side of the tracks to the other. At the peak of American mobility in the late 19th and early 20th century, 1 out of 3 Americans is moving every year. We sustained this extraordinary rate of mobility for about a century. As late as 1970, 1 out of 5 Americans is moving every year. Today, the census recently told us that we have set a new record. It is now down to 1 out of 13. The decline in geographic mobility is the largest social change of our lifetimes, and maybe the least remarked. Because when Mary Edsley won her case, it didn't just mean that she could belong to the town she wanted to belong to. It meant that anyone in America could follow their own destiny, right? They could move toward opportunity. Of course, it's 1820 in Ohio, right? So not just anyone. Ohio has discriminatory racist laws on the books that impinge on the mobility of African Americans. This is a country in 1820 that still practices chattel slavery. And the most literal definition of enslavement is the deprivation of mobility. I know this because the way in which enslaved peoples contested for their own freedom was running away, right? It was through the exercise of that mobility. And so you can trace a history of America through our exercise of mobility. We invent a right that nobody else on earth has, which is the right to go and live where you want. That spreads out from the United States around the world to many other societies that restructure themselves to allow it. For 150 years, we pursue it with unparalleled ardor. And one of my favorite things to do is to go back and read the European travelogues of people coming to the United States. They think we're so weird, right? They're looking at Americans leaving the places where they're doing fine. Tocqueville's phrase for this is that we are restless in the midst of prosperity. It's like, look, you've got a perfectly good farm and you decide to put everything in the wagon and go to some other state to see if you can get a better farm. Why don't you just accept your lot in life? Right? It really puzzles the Europeans. They're convinced it's a national character flaw. And Americans see it really differently. They persistently write about our perpetual migrations as our greatest national asset, that this is the thing that makes America America, is the fact that we don't necessarily accept our lot in life, that we strive for something more than we had. And so the story I tell in the book is about the invention of mobility. It's about the pursuit of mobility. And then it's about the last 50 years in which we've ground to a halt as a web of rules and regulations, many of which were very well intended, have conspired to restrain our mobility. And they have restrained it unequally. It used to be the people who were likeliest to move were the people who had the most to gain from those moves. And today, the people who are likeliest to move are the people in this room, right? People with high levels of education, people with relatively high levels of income. There's a segment of American society that remains fairly mobile, but it is an increasingly narrow sliver. For people with the access to opportunity, with the access to mobility, America remains a really good place to live. But for an increasing portion of this country, which can no longer move to the places where they have the greatest opportunities, America is no longer a land of unlimited prospects. And you can look at a map of the United States and see this play out. We know that 50 years ago, if somebody had moved from a really poor place in America to a really rich one, they would have ended up ahead. A janitor in Alabama who relocates to Providence 50 years ago does better in Providence than he had done in Alabama, earns more money, maybe jumps occupational brackets because there are more opportunities here. And he has a little more in the bank account at the end of every month. Today, if that same person makes the same move, he ends up behind. He'll still earn, his income will go up by just as much, if not more. But the housing costs will swallow more than 100% of the gain. He'll end up with less in the bank account at the end of each successive month. That has initiated another great sea change in America. For 200 years, people moved from the poorer places in America to the richer ones. And today, people are moving from the richer places in America to the places where the housing is cheap, even if it doesn't give them the greatest opportunity. And so the narrative of the book is about how we invent mobility, how we pursue mobility, and then a set of changes over the course of 3 generations of progressive reforms, which, although largely well-intentioned, have resulted in the extraordinary restraint of mobility and with it, the death of the American dream. And it's a little bit of an uncomfortable narrative for me to be telling because my villains are not necessarily the usual villains here. I'm looking at reformers who some of whom had terrible intentions and write about it in just so many words. And some of them had really noble intentions. They were trying to protect the environment. They were trying to protect history, the character of their own communities. They were trying to empower the voiceless. And in the process, they ended up setting up a system that did the opposite of each of those things, that has resulted in more environmental degradation, in widening inequality, and in the disempowerment of the vulnerable populations that the system they created was intended to protect. And I wanted to write a book that would help us grapple with these ironies, that could go back and look at the policy changes of the last 50 years and say, did these things fulfill their promise? If these were the liberal goals that were intended to be advanced by these changes, are we closer to that mark now? Has society improved? Would anyone look at 1970 and look at today and say, gosh, America is a place which has really vanquished inequality, which, the economy, GDP growth has declined in each successive decade from that point. So we haven't created greater economic growth. We've created a more unequal society. And fundamentally, we've also broken our politics in the process. Because there's one other thing about mobility, and we can get more into this later. Mobility changes you. If you relocate from one place to another, it doesn't just change your economic prospects in life. It changes your whole orientation to the world. You're likelier to reach out, to become invested in new friendships, new organizations. Civic life depends on a continual inflow of new arrivals. And as we have choked off our mobility, we have also choked off our community. And so we end up with a country where a tremendous portion of the population feels dispirited, locked out of opportunity, looked down upon or condescended to by the places where many people still have it. And the people in those places are pursuing a set of objects that they think are noble and are having these unintended consequences. And so my hope is to talk with Marc and with all of you about some of the reasons this has happened and what we can do about it.
So I'm particularly thrilled to welcome Yoni here. As Yoni mentioned, we went to college together. And so it's sort of fun to be here at a college talking again. And I also want to say, I think probably folks have some sense of your argument now. You've been on Morning Joe. You've had pieces in The Atlantic. You had the Saturday column in the Wall Street Journal. You were on Andrew Sullivan's podcast. Like you seem to be everywhere. So I don't want to belabor things that I bet you a lot of folks here have read or seen. I will say that there's more in the book though. I've read the book and it's as mentioned in the New Yorker review today. It's a series of beautifully told stories, so it goes down easy. It's not a happy story, but it's beautifully written. I want to start by asking you about a phrase that you use throughout the book, which was new to me, and maybe it's in the academic literature, but I didn't know it, which is zone of emergence. What does that mean? What's the history of it, and what's its relevance to this story?
Yeah, I started thinking about this book when I was living in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in an apartment that was already a little too small for my family and already cost us a little bit more than we could afford. And I was living in an area of Cambridge. These days, it's sort of a byword for elitism. Cambridge historically was the gritty industrial town across the river from Boston. So I was living in what had been for generations a working class neighborhood. And I could look out my window and see who lived there now, and it was people like me. But it had a very special role in the world. Sociologists had come and studied that particular neighborhood, my particular street, because it had been a place where one wave of immigrants and internal migrants after another had landed in Cambridge and pulled themselves up, moved on to someplace a little bit better. And then the next wave had come in behind them. And they coined this term to describe my neighborhood, a zone of emergence. And then they found them in cities throughout the country. And many of you, wherever you're from, can probably think of a neighborhood in your city that once functioned like this. Sort of the landing pad, the place where new arrivals come and emerge into the life of the city, pull themselves up economically, climb socially, and launch their children into something better than they had had. And it struck me as really remarkable that a neighborhood that had served that role successfully for 100 years, as wave after wave after wave of new arrivals of all races and backgrounds had come to Cambridge and lived in that neighborhood, had suddenly stopped doing that. Neighborhood change is an old story. Neighborhoods change. One neighborhood changing is not a crisis. But you could tell the same story about the zones of emergence in any American city. Throughout the most prosperous American cities, the zones of emergence were dying. They were turning into enclaves of upper middle class professionals for the most part, and there was no longer a place in many of those cities for that next wave to come in and to find the opportunity that had been there for 100 years. And so that's what set me off on this journey. I looked out my window and I said, something has gone horribly wrong. And it must have been a relatively recent change, because through a whole set of radical social changes, right, through world wars, through the Great Depression, this neighborhood continued to serve the same function. And something changed in the last few decades that has suddenly cut it off from that function. And I wanted to know what it was.
So you mentioned Tocqueville as sort of a starting point. And of course, Tocqueville is somewhat readable. It's also a tome. And it's got all sorts of interesting observations about America in the 1830s and all these things that differentiate American society from European society. We're joiners. We join all these voluntary associations. As you mentioned, we're more mobile. at one point he mentions the quality of our women, which right is probably a little gauche to say today, but he lists it's a long litany of distinctions. Yeah. You've picked this one to be the one that is the essence of the American experience, and it's and simultaneously the one that is at the root of our problems today. How did you pick mobility out of all those other potential sources of change?
Yeah, and it's a good question, and I think goes beyond Tocqueville. He creates a genre. Lots of other people after Tocqueville or simultaneously with Tocqueville are coming over here, trying to write their own democracy in America. You get Bryce, you get Chevalier. It's a common theme, right? So each of them has their own observations, but they all come back, I think, to two particular things about America that seem really weird to them. One is our extraordinary mobility and the penchant Americans have for moving. This is what really puzzled them. In Europe, you move when you're desperate. You move when you're destitute, when you have no other choice. When people moved into London in the 1600s, it was so unsettling that they coined a new term for these people who had cut loose from their place in the social hierarchy. They called them the mobile vulgus, these moving people, which they eventually contract down to mob. That's where we get the word mob, right? A mob is a bunch of people who are no longer in their proper place in the world. That was how Europeans thought of mobility. And they're coming over and they're looking at Americans, and these Americans who are perfectly respectable, doing perfectly fine in life, are picking up stakes and moving. And they find this just like surpassingly weird. But it's also the Americans who write about it. So you can find all of these contemporary accounts where people are trying to define what the American character is. And they keep circling this. They say, we're a migratory people. My favorite expression of this is one paper which says, we are no bed of oysters, right? Stuck to one place forever. It's a good Ocean State image, right? And you can see this in the self-definition. Like, people will tell you what is interesting about their own lives and their own communities. And this is what Americans settle on. They say we're a migratory people. We move a lot. And that really is what seems to differentiate them from the Europeans who are coming over. The other thing that they're all focused on is the civic life. And what's really funny about it is all the Europeans come over and they make these same two observations. They say there's a national character flaw in Americans. They're always moving. They're not really loyal to home, to hearth, to community, to family. We don't know what's wrong with them. Also, we're insanely jealous of their civic life. They have the most vibrant organizations. They have so many voluntary associations. They spring up like mushrooms after the rain. Every purpose that the human mind can conceive, there's a voluntary association for it. And I've never found any of them who put the two halves of that coin together. But of course, the reason that American civic society is so vital is that everybody's new in town, right? Like, people are always moving. And when you move, maybe you haven't been to church in a month, or in a few years, but maybe you show up on Sunday so that you can meet your new neighbors, or you knock on somebody's door, or you talk to somebody sitting next to you at the bar. You put yourself in the uncomfortable situation because you don't really have a choice. If you remain in the same place for a very long period of time, over time, your social relationships will tend to atrophy. You stop going to the meeting because it's just the same thing, one year after another. Your friends move away or they pass away, and your social relations will tend to atrophy. The best way to counteract that is to live in a community with lots of new people moving in, which again stimulates the formation of new kinds of organizations and relationships. So that's really what it wasn't just looking at Tocqueville, but by looking at a bunch of these different travelogues and looking at the contemporary American accounts, they kept coming back to these same two features. And I started to see them as intrinsically linked, as the thing that had made the thing that they loved best about America was actually created by the thing that they hated most about America.
So just to put a point on it, like, you're explaining bowling alone, the phenomenon, with an explanation that Bob Putnam did not come up with. Is it?
Yeah, and probably would hate, right? There's something very counterintuitive about this. Like, if you talk to people, what does community mean to you? You get sort of the Cheers definition, right? A community is where everyone knows your name. I think empirically that's actually not true. A community is a place where many people know your name. And also there's a new guy. And you got to walk, like in every episode of Cheers, there's somebody new who walks into the bar, or it'd be really boring. And that, you gotta mix the two together. Communities do gain strength and vitality out of longtime membership and involvement, but they also gain strength and vitality out of the continual mixing in of new members. And I think that a lot of the literature on this, I'll tell you one other finding, which is that if you look at voluntary associations across time, they usually have a steady rate of attrition, right? So the number of members who leave every year is usually about the same. What tends to differentiate a really healthy voluntary association from one that's dying is the rate of accession, right? So maybe they always lose, you're in a part of you lose 7% every year. But when you're growing and new and vital, you're gaining 20% a year. You don't even notice the 7% leaving, right? Like it's just growing by leaps and bounds. By the time your new membership rate falls to 2%, you pay a lot of attention to the 7% who are leaving every year. So naturally, intuitively, we tend to think of communities as entering decline because of departures. But the thing that usually sinks any voluntary association, any community, is a lack of new arrivals. And that it's a really powerful thing once you start to see the world in this way, that the continual infusion of new people in our communities was what kept those communities really healthy. And as we've choked off the flow of people, our communities are changing. They're also changing in that they're becoming much more homogenous as a result of this. So if you bring in people with a lot of different backgrounds into your community who are moving from all over the country, they bring with them their prior political allegiances, their prior experiences of life. Over time, most of us tend to like to conform to those around us, right? There's always one guy in any group who has exactly the opposite position as everyone else. But most of us try to do the same things that other people in our community are doing. We adopt the views. You can show this in the political science literature, that people over time will tend to blend into the politics of the community in which they live. As America has stopped moving, we've become more politically polarized too. Because instead of bringing new people into the communities with new perspectives, who become your friends and neighbors, you have to see the legitimacy of their perspective, you have to live alongside them, forge relationships with them. Instead, over time, the communities homogenize. They all tend toward the same political points of view, and we end up with a much less vibrant social landscape. And so, this is not Putnam's explanation at all, but I think that if we put mobility into the picture, we get a really different sense of the problem.
As former Mayor Cicilline knows, we all received our new property assessments in the last month. It's not his fault. Property assessments have certainly out here on the east side, and I bet a bunch of the folks who are in this room live near Brown, went up substantially. You also talk a lot in your book about Flint.
Yeah.
And if we all moved to Flint, we could probably find similar properties at a better price and certainly a lower assessment. And you make a distinction in the book between an affordability crisis and a mobility crisis, and say that we fundamentally misunderstand these two things. Explain that, if you would, and how it's relevant to sort of this issue.
I went to Flint because I was having a conversation like this one, and at the end about the way that we're pricing people out of opportunity in cities. And at the end of it, a man came up to me and said, "You have no idea what the heck you're talking about. I'm the congressman from Flint. I've got exactly the opposite problem as the one you're describing. If you want to see the other side of this coin, you come to my district and I'll show you around." And I took him up on that challenge and spent a lot of time walking around Flint, talking to Congressman Kildee and thinking about the other side of this coin, which is that there's lots of places in America with abundant housing and an absolute dearth of opportunity. I would like to revitalize each of those places. That would be great. It's not such an easy thing to do. And to the extent that we think of our problem simply as an affordability problem, it starts from a premise that people are where they are. And what you need to do is to move the jobs to the people. You need to revitalize the communities. You start from an assumption of stasis. We don't have a great track record of doing that. I wish the place-based policy had a much richer track record than in fact it does. We're not very good at revitalizing communities that have fallen. We are pretty good at dynamism. That has historically been America's great strength. And the communities that are in decline today may not be the ones that are in decline tomorrow, right? Like Ohio, where Mary Ansley lived in the 1820s was a great place to be. By the 1840s, it's the first state to suffer major population loss. People are moving out further. Ohio is no longer a good place to be. By the 1880s, Cleveland's like the wealthiest city in the country. It's where Rockefeller is setting up shop, and like the same towns in Ohio were good places to live some decades and not good places to live other decades. This is the thing about conceiving it as an affordability crisis. Affordability says what you want to do is create the housing, put people in the housing. And I got to tell you, like, if you're lucky enough to get a permanently entailed affordable unit, you have won the lottery, and you are never again going to put yourself in a position where you are searching for housing. It doesn't matter if you're stuck in a dead-end job. It doesn't matter if your kid's school is no good. You have a winning lottery ticket and you'd be crazy to give it up. Rent control has the same dynamic, right? These are good, useful programs in some ways, but they all are radical curtailments of mobility, and with it, alter the life prospects of the people who are the beneficiaries of these programs. And so I'd go even a step further saying, like, it's not just that we're misdiagnosing the problem, it's that many of the solutions that policymakers are advancing are actually inadvertently sort of ruining the lives of the people they are benefiting. And that's not what anyone intends, but it is too often what happens. I talked to one woman in Flint who really drove this home to me. I asked her why she was still living there, and we started with all the answers you'd expect, and they're all good answers, because moving is always a pain in the neck. I've moved lots of times in my life. I've never wanted to move. I hate wrapping dishes in newspaper. I hate the dislocations and trying to figure everything out again. There's always good reasons not to move, and she gave me all the usual good reasons. She has family in Flint. She has a church she really loves. All made sense to me. And then she said, but my sisters are in Texas, and I'd love to go down there with them, but I'm in a HUD-subsidized apartment, and I'd never get that down there. And so I'm in Flint forever. And I thought, that was not what HUD was trying to do. HUD was not trying to tell this woman, stay in Flint where there are no jobs, where your kids and your grandkids aren't going to have the prospects you want them to have, and we'll pay you to do it. No, they were trying to provide housing to somebody who needed affordable housing. But the practical impact of that program is that her sisters are thriving in Texas. And she was telling me about the cars they drive. And I mean, her eyes lit up. The simple things in their lives were so far out of her reach that she was really animated describing them to me. And yet they were utterly unattainable to her because she had been the lucky beneficiary of a housing subsidy.
One of the stories that I was sort of struck by, and I'd almost wish you'd spent more time on it in the book, I was just sort of surprised by it, was what happens at the beginning of the New Deal. And what I think probably most progressives would say is this great triumph of progressivism is Roosevelt coming in with the Homeowners Loan Corporation and the Federal Housing Administration, and basically saving people who are otherwise going to be evicted from their home, lose their homes, lose their savings, and be out on the street in a moment of national emergency. And he sort of finagles the financial marketplace so that people can have a longer extended period to pay back a loan, and that they don't have to put as much down. And it's probably for most people who purchase a home here, like that's the beginning of the sort of notion of home ownership that you have. You come out pretty critical of those decisions. And would you tell us the story of what he was doing, why you think it was a mistake, and what he should have done otherwise in that moment of crisis? All
these people came to hear us, and you want me to talk about the intricacies of federal financing housing policy?
Yes.
Sorry to do this to you. So at the start of the Great Depression, the key driver is it's a banking crisis, right? And FDR is trying to stabilize the banks. The banks are failing in large part because people are defaulting on their mortgages. This is a key driver of it. Until you can stabilize the housing markets, you can't bring the banking crisis to an end. And mortgages were really different back then. A normal mortgage was like 5 years. It was for only 50% of the value of the house. It was a pretty low risk business for the banks, because a 5-year mortgage is short enough that the neighbor is not going to change, the property is not going to significantly switch its value. A 50% down payment means even if it does, you're probably covered, you can get your equity back out. They never expected people to start defaulting, but what's happened is that your monthly mortgage payment on that thing is now, many people inconceivably have become underwater on their loans. The house was worth less than they still owed. Their monthly mortgage payment was way more than it would cost to rent the house. And so they default on their mortgage and go rent a house down the street, right? Why not do that? And so the feds figure out that they're going to have to change the incentives for people. They have to make it better to continue to pay your mortgage than just to default on it by lowering the monthly payment so that the monthly payment for a mortgage needs to be less than the cost of renting a house. This is the key goal of federal policy as they try to stabilize the housing market. And they create what any of you who own a home are now familiar with, right? They stretch the term to 20 years and then to 30 years. They lower the down payment down to 20%. They figure out how to get that number low enough so that it's less expensive to buy a home. But nobody's thinking like it's a really good idea to have 30-year mortgages. They're literally just running the equation and be like, how long do we have to stretch this thing so we can drive the payment down? And it creates an unintended consequence. I hesitate to cast aspersions at Congress, but Congress has created a mandate here where it tells the federal government, stabilize the housing market, but we're not going to fund it, right? Like figure out how to do this on a cost neutral basis. And so they're being asked to shoulder more risk without paying the cost of that risk. And the way they square the circle in the Federal Housing Administration that really is the prime villain here, they say the problem is Americans are always moving around. If we're going to give people 30-year mortgages, we need to know that 20 years from now, that neighborhood is still worth what the neighborhood is worth now. And that means you can't integrate racially because that could change the housing values. So we're only going to loan to properties which put a racial covenant which says you can only sell to somebody of the same race. This literally becomes a precondition for federal loans. And the other thing they say is we want to make sure that it's not going to go from residential to industrial or from a neighborhood of single family homes to apartment buildings. So we're only going to loan if you zone it and permanently restrict what can be built in the neighborhood. And we're trying to stop people from moving around so much. It's not that any federal policymaker says this would be really good for the country. It's that the finance geeks who have been placed in charge of doing the federal housing on a cost neutral basis have to square a circle. They need to find a way to be able to make these loans without losing any more money. In fact, it turns out to be tremendously profitable. If you actually freeze people in place, it becomes much more predictable. You've lowered your risk. You can make more money than the banks. And at some point, the feds actually are able to pull back and allow a lot of private lending to resume, but only after they've imposed these rules over the whole country. And so we end up with a country where pretty much the whole country becomes zoned and racially restricted. The covenants get struck down by the Supreme Court not that long thereafter, but the zoning is still with us today.
And so let's. I've got probably two more questions before I can go to the audience. I guess the first question should be: what has been the racial dynamic of these shifts that I think you argue begin in the 30s, and then but there's sort of a period where things were still growing, mobility increases, then something changes. Explain what changes and what the impacts are, I guess, on a class and on a racial basis.
Yeah. So, we zone America. But mobility as late as 1970, still 1 out of 5 Americans is moving, right? That's 3 times our current rate of mobility. It's almost like it's hard to. I talk to people who remember moving as kids in the 60s and 70s, and they remember things like the welcome wagon lady, or there were these social institutions that were sort of built around a nation that was constantly on the move that we just don't have anymore. So what changed? What changes is a bunch of progressive reformers in the 1970s, and Marc's book tells the story better than mine in some ways, are interested in solving a bunch of problems, right? They have a critique of the New Deal. They say big business has gotten into bed with big government. The regulators have been captured by industry. What we need to do is to arm private citizens and public interest groups with the right to go to court and challenge the decisions of government, to force government to act in the public interest. And they're right about this, by the way. Big government and big business have gotten into bed in the 70s, right? Like Rachel Carson writes Silent Spring because the chemical industry is killing all the birds. Ralph Nader writes Unsafe at Any Speed because highway regulators are doing the same thing with the auto industry. That they're turning a blind eye to obvious problems. But the solution turns out to be worse than the problem that they're diagnosing. Because if you give a right to people to challenge governmental decision-making, it's sort of a 1-2 punch. We'd spent the previous 100 years making every question of development in the country contingent on government approval. That's what zoning does. It says you can't really build just because it's your property. You need to go through a review process. Then we layer on a whole bunch of requirements to get through that process. And then in the 1970s, we say, and anyone who doesn't think we've done it correctly can sue. And what that does is it arms anybody with enough time and money and enough anger to grind to a halt any new development anywhere in the country. You can stretch out, even if your legal challenges are ultimately dismissed, by going to court and by investing in those cases, you can stretch out the development window where the development is no longer economically feasible. Often you can win, right? Because maybe somebody didn't dot their I or cross their T. Some of these challenges are very reasonable. Some are incredibly unreasonable. I tell a story in the book of a parking lot not far from where I live next to a transit station that has been tied up in community hearings and litigation for 25 years as they try to put housing on the empty parking lot next to the transit station. That's sort of nobody's great public policy goal, except that the people living next to it would really rather not have multifamily development on that parking lot. They like parking there. And so you end up with these really perverse outcomes. So that's what changes. What it does is something that you can't see at the local level, right? So people are no longer moving across the country toward opportunity. We have increasing parts of this country where opportunities are declining and poverty is increasingly intergenerational. But mobility is declining unequally, right? It's particularly the working classes, it's particularly people without college degrees who see their mobility constrained. For the first time that we can document, we have a large racial gap, or since emancipation, we have a large racial gap in mobility, which has been widening in recent years. Across a variety of indicators, what you see is the inability to exercise mobility is widening American inequality and keeping us from constructing the kind of society that I think many of the people who created these changes thought they would bring into being. And there's a deep irony in that, right? People put these ability to challenge governmental decision-making in place because they thought that government was not acting in the public interest. But it's very hard to look at the aggregate impact of all those challenges and say, yeah, this was great. This was exactly what we were trying to do.
I was going to make it 2 more questions.
Go for it.
The first one is I don't think you used this word in the book, which is sort of was, maybe my memory is faulty, but was remarkable, which is that in a lot of these stories, it is a white community that is trying to keep out Black people using zoning, redlining. There's a whole series of mechanisms. Today, there's a fear of gentrification. And I don't know whether you use gentrification in the book, but like that is a fear, that is a hold on mobility from communities that are already majority African-American or majority minority, them not wanting, particularly if you're a renter in that neighborhood and build a multifamily, particularly at affordable rate, you're worried about your rent rising and then you're getting pushed out of the neighborhood that is historically of your community. Would you at least address that here and remind me if you addressed it in the book?
No, I don't use the word in the book because it's a complicated word, right? It can refer to, there's no commonly agreed upon definition of it, and it refers to a wide variety of changes in communities. The fundamental dynamic here is that we don't have enough supply in the places where people want to live. And that leads to people pushing into areas they wouldn't otherwise live because they're trying to get a hold in the housing market. I have tremendous sympathy for any historically disadvantaged community that feels itself displaced by these changes. But one of the reasons that it cuts so deep when it happens is because the people being displaced out of a gentrifying community know that there is no better place for them to go, right? If you're operating under rules of housing scarcity, if you have that community, it's not replicable, right? You're not going to be able to establish a new community for the group that resided there, or the people there aren't going to be able to move out into other kinds of places where they might want to be. And so what was a persistent phenomenon in American history. I went back researching this book to see my great-grandfather's tenement on the Lower East Side, which had been singled out by reformers as a hellhole of a building that exemplified what was wrong with tenements. The building's still there. The neighborhood has changed, right? It was Jewish for a long time, and then it became Chinese. The Chinese did gentrify it. The rents went up as they moved in, but that was healthy, right? That was the zone of emergence, which is the older model of neighborhoods changing over. People start to worry a lot more about gentrification, where you're no longer talking about one community succeeding another, but you start to talk instead about the opportunities to do this vanishing entirely. But it's continued to gentrify that neighborhood. If I tried to rent my great-grandfather's hellhole of a tenement, it would cost me $7,200 a month. His cherrywood floors now, though, so I think he didn't have that particular feature at the time. The way that these communities change leaves people feeling really vulnerable. And so I totally understand the concerns about gentrification. And in a world of extreme housing scarcity, they make a lot of sense, right? Because it's like a game of musical chairs where there just aren't enough chairs to go around. If somebody comes into that game and sits down in your seat, you're going to end up standing at the end of the music. If you are adding lots of housing, then you don't have quite the same debates over gentrification, where people are at the level of individual choice deciding, right? Some communities remain really, really robust even as you're adding a lot of housing because they have a high degree of social cohesion and lots of individuals in those communities are choosing to remain within those communities. Other communities tend to dissolve because given the individual choice about whether to stay or go, lots of people can see other reasons to move elsewhere. That is an old American story. It's a bittersweet American story, right? That the same story can be told as sort of the path of upward mobility in America or the dissolution of the old neighborhood. But that was the story that we were telling to ourselves for 200 years. And then in recent decades, as we encountered conditions of extreme housing scarcity, the story no longer sounded so good. And the communities that were pressured in this way could see no way to reconstitute themselves elsewhere, could see no way to really embrace the opportunity.
So finally, I want to ask you a question as an academic in a way that may get you in a little bit of trouble, which would be fun for me. For several decades, the story that the Academy has, I think, passed down is that there was an epic battle in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s between the forces of good, represented generally by Jane Jacobs, and the forces of evil, generally represented by Robert Moses. And everyone knows the story of Jane Jacobs from her award-winning book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, published, I think, in 1961. And everyone knows the story of Robert Moses, who was the most powerful figure in the history of New York and built highways and parks and housing developments, well, not through the Pulitzer Prize winning The Power Broker, written by Robert Caro in 1974. And like this duality between this sort of nice lady who was going to preserve the neighborhood and this evil, imperious figure of Moses, like, has just sort of taken hold in sort of the public imagination and the Academy in a way that, like, now there are operas about. And I've seen in the coverage of your book, you quoted as sort of saying, we got this one wrong, that Jane Jacobs is not the benighted figure that we think. So there's a two-parter. One is that an accurate representation? What did Jacobs get wrong? And two, how did the Academy, which is supposed to study these things and understand this, if my supposition is true, how has the Academy gotten it wrong for so long?
Look, Jane Jacobs got a lot of things right. That's the place to start. She's a wonderful urbanist who's living in the West Village, and she writes this book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, at a time when the academic consensus was that cities were terrible, and that what you needed was the rationality of planning to sort of sort them out and separate their function. She said, no, all the things you're trying to change are what makes cities so attractive, right? They mix people together. They mix uses. They're vibrant and vital and diverse. Let's celebrate them instead of bulldozing them and replacing them with large poured concrete plazas. I think that's great. And you can read her book and periodically you sort of want to stand and applaud, right? It's a great, passionate defense of cities. My problems with Jacobs start not with the book, but with what she then did, what she'd done before, she bought her home in the West Village. It had a candy store on the ground floor. She rips out the candy store and turns it into a single family home. She rips off the facade of the building, which was a historic building, and puts on modern metal sash windows, such that when she landmarks the block eventually, the landmark report says the home no longer has any historic value. She was preaching one thing and doing another, which is very human. That's okay. But what she then did was, in order to stop Bob Moses, she is one of the key promulgators of these legal and cultural changes that give local communities the power to decide who gets to live within their boundaries, right? That is her fundamental agenda. She is anti-displacement, and what that means to her is don't let the developers in, don't let them build. And she's very clear about this at the time. And the legacy of that is not clear for a decade or 2 decades. You can see this as a David versus Goliath story, and she's playing the role of David. But she and Moses, I think, have a sort of deep progressive kinship that comes out of the reformers of the original progressive era. The reformers of the original progressive era had soured on politics. They viewed it as tawdry and corrupt. Politicians were the worst. Elections were not to be trusted. And what you wanted to do was to devolve things in 2 directions. You wanted to push it up to professionals, to experts who could serve in commissions and other bodies that were insulated from electoral politics, or you could push it down to ordinary people. Moses represents one strain of this line of thought, right? He's operating with almost no democratic accountability. Jacobs represents the other tendency. She's equally distrustful of elections. She is anti-democratic. She is not pushing her neighbors to sign up and register to vote and to go vote the bums out. Instead, what she does is she tries to create a bunch of processes where she and her highly educated friends can go and testify in front of the various commissions, draft their own plans, and challenge the expert decision-making being made by the bureaucrats. What you end up with is a hollowing out of small d democracy. And so her solutions basically say, look, we're going to have this rule-bound process where there's hearings. So, you've got to be able to be in a job where you can go at 7 p.m. on a weeknight, you can go and somebody's watching your kids. So maybe you're wealthy enough to pay for childcare and you can stand there and testify. And it helps if you've actually got the legal education to have read the zoning code and to know its provisions. If you have all of those things going for you, this system works really well. I talked to one developer at one point who said to me, I don't even bother trying to build in the wealthy neighborhoods. I just go over to the poor part of town, particularly if it's something that nobody wants. And then I'll never forget the next thing he said to me. He said, "Is that thing on?" It was not a revelation. Like, you could ask anyone in the poor part of town, they already know that. They know that this system doesn't actually work. It's not actually democratically accountable, that the people who get the decisions that they want are the well-educated and the wealthy, and that at their end of town, despite starting community groups, despite their protests, the thing still goes ahead. Like, they can see this play out in fact. And so that I think is what the scholars got wrong. They looked at Jacobs versus Bob Moses, and they said, okay, this is David versus Goliath. I look at the two of them and I'm like, you're both wrong. What we need is a democratically accountable system. What you need to do is to not be so distrustful of low-income voters that you are trying to disempower them either through bureaucratic proceduralism or through a set of community activism that is non-electoral in nature, right? You have to trust people ultimately in a democracy. And the tough part about trusting people in a democracy, as some of you may recently have noticed, is sometimes they make really terrible decisions. But that doesn't mean that we junk the democracy. It means that to all of us falls the hard work of persuasion that convinces voters to cast their ballots differently the next time around. And so I think that's what the academics got wrong. They didn't, for the most part, trust the voters either. The academics, I can say this as a lapsed academic myself, right? Like, I've spent a lot of time becoming the experts. They like systems that value expertise. They like systems that privilege education. They like systems that let people like them have an outsized voice because they think they should have it. And I get that temptation, right? Like sometimes you're sitting in a hearing and somebody stands up and testify and you just want to like put your head in your hands and think like, what is this person saying? And then somebody else stands up and testifies and maybe they don't have a great education and maybe they don't have a lot of sophistication, but they're talking from the heart and they're bringing a perspective that nobody else would have had. And if you trust electoral democracy, I think you get better outcomes. If what you do is create systems that are set up deliberately, and I think each of them set up a system deliberately to disempower ordinary voters, what you get is a system that doesn't work for ordinary people.
Neil, I think I should open it up. I took up too much time, so open it up to questions.
Questions. If you don't mind. Thank you for your time and thank you for your talk. I moved to Providence. I joined a voluntary association and we're trying to build more housing in Providence. And that's a big problem here because I don't know if you looked at the statistics, but we're down for per capita housing built with communities like Flint, Michigan. And you would think that that means that like Flint, we're not building housing because people don't want to live here. But in fact, it's the reverse. We're not building housing because too many people want to live here. And one of the features that I think confuses me about the situation is that it's sort of apolitical. There's a strong and vibrant Democratic Party in the state of Rhode Island and in the city of Providence. And I think that's great. I vote Democratic. But there's no competition, right? You would think that in a democratic system, if one party is wrong on an issue, there would be a spur to the other party to say, well, wait, we can capture all these voters who aren't being represented by the party in charge.
Let's just bring it to a question.
Sure.
Okay.
Which is why? Why is it the case that the system that we have with zoning and regulation, it's sort of apolitical. There is no competition for voters to say, look, we're the party that will deregulate and make sure that new housing can be built.
It's a good question, and I don't know the specifics of the situation here, so I won't pretend to be able to speak to it. There are jurisdictions where you're seeing movements successfully agitate for change and where you actually see zoning reform. So I do think that there are places where politicians are responsive to it. A lot of what I see actually is a big generational split on this, where people who have grown up in a world where they don't expect to be able to buy a home in the kind of community where they grew up, where they feel priced out of opportunity, tend to be much more active in agitating for change on this. Than generations that maybe bought a home in 1970 or 1990 or even as recently as 2000. Before the appreciation went through the roof, that if you're lucky enough to have done that, then it's a little easier to focus on some of the harms of new development because there are real harms. If you're locked out, it's a little bit more easy to focus on some of the costs of stasis. So I see a generational shift, and that's usually how political change happens. Very few of us are quite flexible enough to change our minds on things. Usually when you get major political shifts in the United States, they fold out over the course of generations. We moved toward a much more restrictive system as the baby boom generation came of age with its concerns about the synthesis of big government and big business, with its concerns about growth and its impact on the environment. And I think we'll probably get more competitive elections around these issues in many places as more and more voters have a different set of concerns that they've come of age thinking about and having front of mind.
Sir, we've got one question up here.
Would be interesting.
Oh, hold on 1 second.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
It would be, I'm tempted to ask a question related to the American obsession with home ownership as opposed to renting, which is true in a number of other countries. But I really want to go because a lot of what you were talking about, with the exception of the Pilgrims, was the same population moving around. And the influx of immigrants certainly plays a role in these dynamics. Our population is shrinking from the existing population, maybe to the point where we have the right amount of housing. But you introduce immigration, either legal or illegal, it seems like it creates a somewhat different fermentation in the housing market. What can you address that at all?
How has immigration played a role? Yeah, no, it's a great question. We've gone through cycles of more and less immigration, and they can correlate in uncomfortable ways with mobility. So you get the great migration out of the American South when we cut off immigration from Europe. That is a massive migration. It's been terrible in the South for the African American population since the end of the Civil War. But mobility only results when suddenly there's a lot of factory jobs in the North and nobody to fill them. And so sometimes there are interesting tensions. We tend to get more internal mobility when levels of international migration are low, and more immigrants coming toward the places with opportunities, and that tends to result in more Native Americans staying where they are. On the whole, though, a society which exhibits high rates of residential mobility is more welcoming and accepting of immigration because of some of the changes I was talking about before, right? When you move, you tend to see that pie getting larger. You tend to see other people's successes as reinforcing your own. If you're staying in place, you tend to see things as a zero-sum game. And so I do think that there's an important political dimension to this. One of the things that made America so capable of absorbing so many waves of immigration was a really high rate of residential mobility. When everybody is new in town, it is a lot easier to accept people. There's a great line from the historian Carl Becker, who says that in most times and places, stranger is a word of danger or warning. And in America, it's a friendly salutation, like, howdy, stranger. And he says that's only because of the way we mix our population, right? That when everybody is a little bit different from everybody else and we're constantly moving around, it gets a lot easier to have an open and tolerant society. And I think there's sort of a profound truth there. And so, although the actual dynamics are complicated in challenging ways, the broader truth that a society that's moving a lot opens itself to immigration and to the historic strength that immigration has given the United States. And a society that becomes increasingly immobile will grow hostile to immigration. I think you can see politically on the map today by mapping voter views of immigration against rates of residential mobility, and it's pretty much a one-to-one match.
Neil, it is exactly 6:01, and I'm going to be respectful of people's time. Do we have time for one more question, and then we'll call it? Okay.
Not a question, just a follow up on your parking lot near the subway story. I don't know if you saw it, but the Boston Globe had an article about 2 days ago. There was a complexly negotiated law passed in Massachusetts getting rid of restrictions on building near subway stations, metro stations, because that way poor people could live farther out and get to their jobs. And that was funded subsequently by the state, so that there was actually money to do the building. And an administrator has just paused that law because the money was not voted for at the same time as the law. So it was an unfunded mandate.
Yoni, before you, I think we had a question right down here from a student. So I'll let Yoni respond to that right here.
Thanks. My name's Malcolm. I'm a sophomore. You said before that increased levels of mobility prevents homogeneity in a community, that you bring new people in, new ideas. But is there ever evidence of the opposite, where increased mobility means that people are attracted to places that think and act and are like they are? I mean, I'm thinking in the United States, so much of the politics of a locality has to do with what state you live in. Mm-hmm. And so, someone who's living in California who would rather live in a red state would move to Texas or Arizona or Florida and whatnot. So do you ever see the opposite, where people, same types of people, can, with increased mobility, move to the same place, and then you end up with a more homogenous community?
Yeah, you absolutely see it. And you see it anecdotally a lot. There was a whole book called The Big Sort that sort of imagined that American mobility was leading to our political polarization. I think although it happens at the individual level and makes for good newspaper stories, the same 50 years when we've seen a rapid political polarization are the 50 years when mobility has radically declined, which makes it hard for me to pin one narrative to the other. And there's some really good political science research on this, which suggests that a lot of the original research, which sort of thought this was what it was seeing, they were talking to people and then they were saying like, okay, you've moved to Texas. What are your politics like? And, they were conservative. But they went back and benchmarked it and tried to follow up with people after they'd moved. And a lot of it was the homogenizing effect, right? So what we thought was a sorting out turned out to be a homogenization after people landed. When you go back and you benchmark it, so that people move, and many Americans. I know this as a political journalist. Voters are really complicated. They have interesting constellations of views. They don't necessarily resolve into straight labels. What they choose to emphasize in their political identities is often extremely socially determined. And so people would move from blue states into red states or from red states into blue states and start to emphasize different aspects of their political beliefs. Or they'd actually change their minds on things as they try to conform to those around them. So yes, there is some self-selection. It's a real thing in the world. I don't mean to suggest otherwise. But overwhelmingly, the dominant effect here is the pressure of village life, right? Like we all have some sort of mental model, whether from like reading Hawthorne back in grade school or right, of what it is like to live in a village, how confining that can be. It can be warm, but America was basically a whole nation of people who decided not to live in the village anymore, and then wrote a lot of nostalgic books about how much they missed it while living in New York. And so, but that pressure of village life is like really real. And it leads to homogeneity over time. And it was one of the things that made this place really special, was that we no longer regarded each other like a bunch of judgmental villagers. We developed a different posture. We coined the word pluralism, right? Like we came up with a way to accept difference within our communities. And now I think we're tending away from it.
Great last question. Great last answer. Thank you for being here. It's a privilege for all of us.